I'm just checking to see if it's working.
Applaud, only one hand shows there. Please, the platform is yours, Professor Lal.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Papu, for the introduction. And thank you as well, of course, for the invitation. My thanks to the endowment and to the university for arranging this. And I would also like to express my gratitude to Alicia Shrestha for having facilitated it. Now, the subject matter, the lecture is entitled Gandhi, Race and the Matter of Prejudice. But if I had to put it in the simplest possible language, we could say that this lecture is addressed to the question, was Gandhi a racist? Now, it is in some respects astonishing. I think we should feel astonished that this question is even being asked, because let us not forget that 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, I dare say no one would have posed the question in this particular fashion. Let me be very clear. I don't want to suggest that critiques of Gandhi are, as some people believe, of very recent vintage, that somehow we have become more progressive and therefore we have become more aware of the problems in some of Gandhi's thinking and in the manner in which he conducted himself. Let me say very clearly that the critiques of Gandhi have been there since the onset of his life, his adult life. We're not all aware of them, but certainly some people who have worked on Gandhi for decades are very much aware of the fact that there is really no one in modern history who has been subjected to a more critical scrutiny in his own lifetime than Gandhi was. And so if you go back to, for example, 1920, you see even a member from the very distinguished Tagore family. And here I refer not to Rabindranath, but I refer to Shaumindranath, a very close relative of the great poet, who himself was a critic of Gandhi. You can find his pieces in a collection called Against the Stream. Or you take the Indian communist M.N. Roy, who wrote withering critiques of Gandhi in the 1920s and 1930s. But what is different today is this particular allegation that Gandhi was a racist. And I'm sure that some of you are aware that particularly in the wake of what is called BLM, these allegations have come to the fore. We know that there have been statues of Gandhi that have been defaced. The statue of Gandhi outside the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. has been defaced a number of times. There has been an attempt to remove a bust of Gandhi from the Peace Garden at Fresno. The statue of Gandhi, the newer one in London, because there's an older one in Tavistock Square, but the newer one, which is outside the Parliament complex, was, when the BLM protests were taking place, was put away in cold storage, so to speak. It was covered and everything because, again, there was a fear that the statue would be defaced, right? And it is not really even in the wake of BLM that all of this happened, because sometime before all of this, in Accra, Ghana, the statue of Gandhi was removed after a demonstration. And this was, of course, in the wake of that whole movement, which is a movement to have the statue of Rhodes, like Rhodes must fall movement. So there was a movement 3 years ago there, and that is what led eventually to the removal, really, of the statue of Gandhi as well, right? Now, I say all of this because, as I said, we have to first consider what it means to make a claim of this kind. What are the implications of this claim? And what it tells us not only about Gandhi, but what it tells us about how we think about such things as racism. What is the nature of the modern world? What are the categories through which we think about the world? Now, before I launch headlong into considering some of the issues that come to the fore, by beginning, of course, with Gandhi's life in South Africa, on which I shall spend a considerable amount of time, I think it's necessary to make a few other remarks as well by way of a preface. Right? The first is, and these are questions that I will not be able to address at any length or even really at all, but I want to indicate my awareness of that because in some respects, these questions are critically important. And so the first question there is, in what respects might it be possible to argue that if indeed Gandhi was a racist, that his weakness was only the weakness of his own people? That is that I have heard for some years now a concerted volley of criticism from liberals and secularists and more broadly the Indian left, suggesting that racism is a profound problem in Indian society. Now, I have a somewhat different view of that. I don't at all deny the fact that there is a problem of color discrimination that we have in India in some respects. I don't think it works the same way that it works in the United States, for example. But I mean, sometimes there is this insinuation that Indians are in fact really extremely racist, and to that extent that Gandhi was simply really embodying the values of his own society. I mean, this is a very important question that we'd have to really think about, right? Now, I have to say, of course, that I don't by any means think that racism is the problem of racism is a monopoly of Indian people. Anyone who's familiar with the United States should obviously understand exactly what I mean. Or if you look at the nature of slavery over the course of 200, 300 years in the entire Atlantic, right? And which led, of course, to the creation of new societies in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Or if you look, for example, if you look at Africa, where I've been to Ethiopia and I've been to Tanzania and to Kenya, among other places. And in all of these places, as some of you are doubtless aware, the Chinese footprint today is very large. And one of the things that strikes me in having gone to these places is the profound racism against the Black people among the Chinese. So what I'm really suggesting here is that it seems to me that racism, and in particular the racism directed at Black people, is in fact a universal problem. It's a universal problem, and I think that we will have to, in fact, think not only of how Indians think about the question of race and the categories through which they think about the world, or how people in this country do so, but I think that there is, in fact, a kind of a systemic racism against Black people all over the world, in which no one is really exonerated, so to speak. It is also important to mention in this connection, and that will bring me to the end of my preface and take me then to the meat of my talk, so to speak. It is also important to mention that I do take the view, which was, I think, most cogently, forcefully, eloquently expressed by James Baldwin in his searing indictment against race and racism and white Christian civilization in a book that he wrote called The Fire Next Time. So this book is now over 5 decades old, where if you read the work, one comes away with the impression, which is a view that I share, that we have to understand that racism is in fact a European category of thought with specific origins in the late 18th century in what we would call Enlightenment Europe. And racism is a problem that began in white minds. And in some respects, it is a problem that can only be resolved, so to speak, in white minds. That is, it will have to end with them having to fundamentally rethink what its place is and what is the nature of discrimination in the world. And I say this because I think that, for example, the recent book by Isabel Wilkerson, which has been lauded very much by lots of people, I think is in some respects fundamentally a misleading work. I should also say, although my talks are not directed to that book, of course, now, I should also say that the idea that racism can in fact be seen under the category of caste, and vice versa, that the reverse is true as well, that this is not an argument that is novel with her. In fact, there was a conference that was held in Durban, which was a kind of a universal congress against racism. And some of you might perhaps be aware of the fact that there was an attempt made by Indian Dalits to have caste included in that conference in Durban, which is 15, 20 years ago. That is, that the argument was that caste should actually be placed under the purview of the whole category of racism as well. And there are, of course, apologists for slavery in the American South. George Fitzhugh comes to mind because I read him 40 years ago, so I've been aware of him for a very long period of time, who essentially described racism as a form of caste slavery, right? What I'm suggesting here is that even actually this recent set of considerations where we look at race with respect to caste and vice versa is not, in fact, an argument that is entirely novel. But let me now turn to the whole question of Gandhi and the allegation that he was a racist. What are the charges against him? Let me just very quickly enumerate them, and then I will go over some, if not all of them, in much greater detail. First, that he used openly derogatory language to describe African people during the time that he was in South Africa. Number two, that he took no steps to involve Black people in South Africa in his quest to gain rights for Indians, right? So that he excluded them. That however inclusive Mohandas Gandhi may have been later on in life, to the extent that he was unwilling to, in fact, even think of anyone as an enemy. This is not part of his vocabulary of thought at all. Right? You can think of people who, of course, were opposed to Gandhi, and you can think of Gandhi's critics, but remember that when he writes a letter to Adolf Hitler, well, he actually wrote two letters to Adolf Hitler, neither of which was delivered to Hitler because a British censor stopped them. But both of these letters were addressed as my dear friend, right? Dear friend. And, you know, if you go to social media now, you'll see what I can only describe as extremely juvenile remarks, because they say, well, Gandhi was a friend of Hitler. Of course, there's no recognition here of the fact at all that Gandhi took the view, which was his ontological defense of nonviolence, that there isn't a single human being on this earth who does not in principle have a spark of divinity within him or her, right? I mean, and this is one of the reasons why Gandhi is fundamentally opposed to violence, not the only reason by far, but one of the principal reasons why he is opposed to violence. So I bring this up because I'm suggesting that for someone of this point of view, right, to not include Black people in his quest for the rights of Indians, the rights of oppressed people, seems an indictment. It's certainly a puzzle. Why didn't he actually include Black people in the struggle? Right? Number three, the third charge is that he held Black people to be inferior to Indians and presumably, of course, to white people as well, right? That there is something of a hierarchy that Gandhi has in mind here. Number four, and this is related to the question of race, but it really takes us to the broader ambit of views regarding how Gandhi thought of oppression, how he thought of class, and so on, that in South Africa, he was only interested really in advancing the rights of Indians within the empire, right? So therefore, in other words, that he was actually a loyalist. He was a staunch loyalist. And again, as I said, I want to simply reiterate at this point that these are all charges that I will look at in somewhat greater detail, right? Number five, that contrary to the common perception, he never really had any interest, if you look at his career in South Africa, in the rights of indentured Indians. So these are the principal allegations that have been advanced against Gandhi with respect to the question of race. So let us look at the first of these, namely the fact that he used openly derogatory language, that he used words such as kafir in speaking of the Black people in that country. Did he do so? Unquestionably so. Unquestionably so. I think that if there are things that Gandhi does and if there is a criticism, I think we need to admit what it is, but then we need to try to unravel what some of the complexities here might be. So, for example, in a letter that Gandhi writes to the Natal legislature in 1893, recall that Gandhi had arrived in South Africa in 1893. He had arrived there to work with the law firm of Dada Abdullah. Dada Abdullah actually was a man who had a flourishing business. There is a book written by Charles DeSalvo. There's lots of books, of course, on Gandhi's career in South Africa, but this is a book which really looks at Gandhi's legal career in South Africa. The entire book is devoted to that, published about 8 or 10 years ago. And he looks in substantial detail at some of the kind of petitions that Gandhi filed. What was he really doing there? And he has a critical view, but of Gandhi's years here, but he also understands a number of limitations that I'll get to later on. So in a letter that Gandhi writes to the Natal legislature in 1894, he states, quote, "A general belief seems to prevail in the colony that the Indians are little better, if at all, than savages or the natives of Africa," right? And of course, when you read this, this is where, you sort of collapse within yourself and say, well, did Gandhi really use that language? Well, he did. Even the children are taught to believe in that manner, with the result that the Indian is being dragged down to the position of a raw kafir, We haven't yet determined what the word kafir means. How was it used at that time? And this is going to be an important part of the argument that I'm going to lay forward here. In 1895, he quotes approvingly from an editorial in a South African newspaper called the Cape Times, which condemns those who lumped Indians together with native Blacks, because Gandhi says that they are being put in the same category as the half-heathen native and are being therefore subjected to the harsher laws by which the kafir is governed. Right? Now, how does one assess these observations? Number of considerations come to mind. The first is simply this, that it has been argued by way of a defense of Gandhi that, well, yes, he said these things, but he outgrew all of this, right? So let's take a very simple illustration. Let's take the word kafir. That if you look at volumes 1 to 13 of the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, so this is a 98 volume set, 2 volumes of indices after that, so it's 100 volumes in all. If you look at the first 13 volumes of the collected works, we find the word kafir used 450 odd times. The last appearance of this word kafir is in the collected works is on 25th October 1913. After that, we find Gandhi never using that word again. So one very prominent scholar of Gandhi, Professor Ajay Skaria, is among those who has taken the view. He wrote a piece on this whole question of Gandhi and racism, which was published last year. And I just quote the first sentence. Was Gandhi racist towards Blacks? The answer, the short answer is before 1906, emphatically yes. From 1906 to 1913, qualifiedly yes. After 1913 or so, increasingly no. Right? So that's one defense of Gandhi, to simply say that, well, yes, he did use them, but he was not the man that we came to know later. He outgrew these views that we have to distinguish, as one often does with thinkers and writers, between the older Gandhi and the younger Gandhi. Right? The second view that has been taken, and I'll come back to the question of the word kafir, the second view that has been taken in defense of Gandhi is that he was really echoing only the dominant worldview of his times. It will be very difficult to find any writer in the late 19th century, even in the early 20th century, who was of the view that you could think of everyone, whether you were Black, colored, Indian, Asian, European, as quote equal. There is, of course, what we call the philosophy of natural law, going back several centuries. And under the idea of natural law, the idea was inherent, so to speak, that everyone is really equal. But the question, of course, was how does one actually put any teeth in that idea, that one can make a proclamation of that kind? But this is also the period when natural law is flourishing. This is a period when the Portuguese and the Spanish, to begin with, are completely decimating the Americas, burning people, feeding them to the dogs, committing genocide, right? And something that would be carried on by the other Europeans. I mean, let us not think that the Belgians or the French were far more civilized than the Spanish or the Portuguese. I mean, just remember what was done in the Congo when King Leopold appropriated that entire domain as his own personal fiefdom, and the genocide that took place in the Congo. And this is 300 years after the Spanish and the Portuguese and their conquest of the Americas, right? In the late 19th century, therefore, you could take the view, which in my view is a very weak view. I wouldn't want to offer that in defense of Gandhi, but I put it forward, that Gandhi was simply echoing the dominant worldview of his times. There was a kind of a pseudo-scientific racism. I use the word pseudo-scientific racism advisedly because it seems to me it's redundant. All racism is frankly pseudo-scientific in the sense that there is no scientific basis for it whatsoever. Right? But there has been a supposition, of course, in European thought that there was a scientific basis for racism, right? Which is why sometimes we must use this phrase, pseudo-scientific racism, right? And that as the view changed, Gandhi's views also changed. That is, as the worldview on racism changed, so did Gandhi's views change. That would be the third defense here, right? Which is related to the corollary of the second point. And one can track this, for example, by looking at the pages of Gandhi's own journal in South Africa, Indian Opinion, right? Because before he founded a number of newspapers in India, including Harijan, there was a newspaper that he founded in South Africa, which was published in 4 languages, Indian Opinion. And then if you look at the pages of Indian Opinion over a period of time, you begin to see that it begins to take a different view of the whole question of race, right? So this might be one possible defense as well. Now let me go back to the word kafir. So I decided that I would look up the Oxford English Dictionary because it is really the most historical dictionary of the English of language, that when you find a word in the OED, it gives you examples from a range of time as to how that word has been used from its first recorded instance until very recent times, which is why, of course, the entries for some of these words run to several pages of the unabridged Oxford English Dictionary. Now, the OED reminds us that it has, quote, and I quote, since the mid-20th century, been considered extremely offensive, end quote. Note that it is not saying since the mid-19th century, since the mid-20th century. Now, Gandhi is using this word in the late 1800s, moving into the early 1900s. And this is well before the time that the word became, that its usage became marked as extremely offensive according to the Oxford English Dictionary, right? The dictionary also tells us that the word was used to designate non-Muslims and members of other groups such as the Hosa and the Naguni, right? as well as blacks encountered all along the Swahili coast, most of whom were referred to, right? These blacks along the Swahili coast were referred to as kafirs by Arab traders as well, So if indeed this was a racist word, then the Arabs were racist as well, obviously, towards black people, in addition to the Indians and of course the Europeans, right? Which might, of course, be congruent with the suggestion I was offering before, namely that there may be a universal problem of racism against black people. All right. But it seems to me that this is instructive, looking at the history of this word, because it is not unequivocally clear what exactly Gandhi had in mind when he was referring to kafirs and why he was referring to them as to black people as kafirs. He doesn't really talk about Africans, he talks about kafirs, and much later on he's going to use the word Zulus. Right? So this word Zulus is increasingly going to begin to replace the word kafirs, and some of it may have to do certainly with the Zulu rebellion, which I'll get to in just a few moments. My next strand of arguments are of the following sort. That when Gandhi went to South Africa, we have to consider that the Indian community was highly splintered. So you had, if you look at the work of the late Surendra Bhanna, Professor Bhanna, who was at Kansas, and Ghulam Wahed, the two of them have written books independently. Professor Bhanna passed away some years ago anyhow. Ghulam Wahed is a South African Indian, perhaps the leading historian in South Africa or among South African Indians who's looked at the Indian community. And he and Ashwin Desai authored a book on Gandhi's years in South Africa, which is an indictment. In fact, this has probably been the most influential book in having generated the view that we must take a very different perspective on what Gandhi was doing in South Africa, that there has been this kind of hagiographic laudatory account of his South African years, which we must revisit according to them. But before they wrote this book, Ghulam Wahed and Suresh Bhanna had written a number of books where they point out that we may need to make a distinction when we're thinking about the history of Indians in South Africa between what are called the passenger Indians and coolie Indians. So coolie Indians were essentially, it's of course a pejorative word, but but that was a term that was used. Remember that what Gandhi himself said, in that famous incident or infamous incident in 1893, just days after he arrives in South Africa, he's thrown off a train, and that brings him to the awareness of something called racism for the first time, right? He says much later on, when he's reflecting back at that incident from the point of view of Europeans in South Africa, they were only coolie Indians. It didn't matter whether you were a barrister. You were simply a coolie barrister. You were always a coolie if you were an Indian. But nonetheless, there is a distinction made within the Indian community between those who arrived as indentured laborers and those who arrived as passenger Indians. That is, people who paid their own passage, which would include people like Mohandas Gandhi. Right? Now, when he arrives there, what he finds is that you've got passenger Indians, you've got indentured Indians, and then, of course, there are different ways in which you can think about the way the communities were splintered, because you had a large number of people who were Gujaratis, and these were largely passenger Indians, and then you had the indentured laborers who were largely Tamilian and Telugu speaking, and some, not very many, because this is different from the Caribbean, some who were Bhojpuri speaking, right? So you had some from the UP Bihar belt, but the bulk of them in South Africa. And here again, this is an anachronism, because remember that there was no South Africa when Gandhi arrived there. You had Natal and you had the Cape Colony, you had Transvaal. What is called the Union of South Africa only came about, of course, in 1910. Right? But the point here simply being that when he arrives there, he finds that he's actually working amidst a large number of Indian communities who barely speak to each other, who barely have any conversation with each other. And I think that this is important to remember, because of course, the question we would have to ask to those who say, so here I move now to that next major criticism, those who say that, well, Gandhi didn't include South Africa, he didn't include Black South Africans in the struggle. We have to ask a number of questions there. Who should he have spoken to? Because just as the Indian community itself was far from being a monolithic community, the Black population of South Africa was not at all monolithic. It's very easy today to think back and say, well, let's just think of them as a whole. Now, if we try to do that, we would fall into exactly the same problem when we simply speak generically of Indians in South Africa. This is a problem that Gandhi became immensely aware of when he arrived in South Africa, particularly after 1894, when he takes it upon himself to now agitate for the rights of Indians, because that is not what he had gone to South Africa to do. He had gone to South Africa to represent Dada Abdullah, right, as someone who was credentialed in law to offer his legal services. And then he's going to deploy these legal services to very different ends in the years to come. So here we must ask the question, if I may invoke the language of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, who speaks for whom? With what rights? With what privilege? How could Gandhi have presupposed to speak on behalf of something called the Black community? And what Black community here are we really thinking of? Right? And I dare say that if Gandhi had done that, today there would be outrage, because the argument would have been, how dare he thought that he could actually speak on behalf of Black people? Because of course we have now come to this reductionist view in the moral universe that we inhabit today, that Black people should speak for Blacks, white people should speak for whites, Indians should speak for Indians, and no one should speak for anyone else, right? There is a kind of, if I may put it this way, moral, not simply, I would say, weakness, a kind of moral and intellectual laziness, which has led us to this view that this is how we actually speak. We don't speak for others at all, so to speak, unless we understand the politics of what that kind of representation really means, right? And this, of course, leads us to the view, did Africans or Black people expect Gandhi to speak up for them? Right? When the critics say that he didn't speak for them, is there something in the historical record that they expected Indians to do so, that they approached Gandhi and said, well, we would like you to speak up for us? And I have to say that there is absolutely nothing in the historical record which actually suggests this, that he was approached by Black people to help them with this struggle. Not at all, right? But now let me go back to add to another layer of thought, because what I'm really doing is I'm exploring a set of ideas here about how we should think of Gandhi in relationship to the question of race. If we go back to the letter he wrote to the Nadal legislature in 1894, what do we find him saying? What we find him saying, and I think this distinction is exceedingly important. What we find him saying is that I object to Indians being lowered down to the level of Black people. He is not objecting at any time, to the best of my knowledge, from everything that I've seen that Gandhi wrote about the question of what we would call race today in South Africa. He's not actually objecting to Black people being raised to the level of Indians. What he's saying here is, I object to Indians being lowered to the level of Black people. And of course, this is coming from an awareness of the politics on the ground. What Gandhi was aware of was that there was a kind of civilizational idiom that had developed in European thinking. this civilizational idiom had set up a scale, what we can call a civilizational scale. At the top of that scale are the Europeans, and then below that you get the Indians, and then that, of course, at the very bottom, you get Black people. We don't need to, at this point, complicate it by asking where did the coloreds belong, the Creole, the mixed people, because we're looking at the generality of the problem, and these are the categories that Gandhi is really working with, right? So, for example, in 1895, that quotation that I had, right? He says he objects to them being placed, the Indians being placed in the same category as the half-heathen native, right? Because what he's aware of is that Black people have been placed at the very bottom, and what the colonial state is attempting to do is to drag Indians down to the level of Black people. And therefore, of course, we have to ask, what does racism actually entail? What kind of racist, if Gandhi was a racist, what kind of racist was he? Because I think you would have to agree with me that when we say that, if we say that Gandhi was a racist, we certainly do not mean by that that he was a racist in the same way as the slave owner in Bristol, whose statue was dragged down by people in the BLM movement in England last summer and then dragged and thrown into the water. We are also saying that Gandhi was not a racist. I think that even the most ferocious critic of Gandhi would not say that Gandhi was a racist in the manner in which obviously members of the KKK were racists and are racists, right? Or that Gandhi was a racist in the manner in which lots of white officials in the state of Mississippi, whose sole intent seemed to be, when they were working, seemed to be to deny Black people the vote, right? I think that we can safely say that Gandhi was not a racist in that sense at all, right? In other words, we understand that racism actually entails a certain form of domination and hegemony. Domination and hegemony, both the use of violent force, the threat of violent force, and obviously, even when violent force is not being used, the idea that there is a set of discriminations in place, and these are part of the natural order, right? What I'm suggesting here is that if Gandhi is not a racist in this particular fashion, then the question is, what does it really mean to say that Gandhi was a racist, right? So were there people who, if, for example, his racism involved a structure of domination, does he argue that Black people should be denied whatever privileges, whatever few privileges Indians might have had? Or is he rather arguing, as I am suggesting is the case, that Indians should not be dragged down to the same level as Black people? Because what he's realizing there is that the state, in fact, has the power to do so. Now, this then brings me to the last series of arguments, which I would like to consider when we look at the whole question of Gandhi, race, and the question of prejudice, which I'm going to speak to, right? I think the first principal argument that I want to advance here is very simply this. It would require enormous amounts of explication by looking at the legal structure of South Africa, but I think you'll get the gist of what I mean when I suggest to you that Gandhi understood that he had no power to challenge the entire legal system. The defense of Indians' rights was only possible if they could be viewed as separate from Africans. Right? This is, it seems to me, central to understand. And that is why I think it's important to distinguish between, to look at the specific wording of what he's saying and try to actually unravel and interpret what he means by that. See, Gandhi is working with the awareness that there is just a legal system that he does not have the power to challenge. At that point in his life, and given the position that he occupied in South Africa. And if he's going to attempt to secure the rights of Indians, he can only secure the rights of these Indians if they are understood to be separate and different from Africans. All right. Now, secondly, it is, I think, very interesting that if you look at Gandhi's interaction with Black people, now I'm moving beyond Black people in South Africa to a broader set of considerations here, that if you look at the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, associated most famously, of course, with Nelson Mandela, but there are other really gigantic figures, Ahmed Kathrada, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, many others, right? And if you look at the American Civil Rights Movement, I find it to be extraordinary that no one, either in the anti-apartheid movement or the American Civil Rights Movement, took the view that modern liberals and others who are being self-righteous about all of this have taken, namely that Gandhi was a racist. Well, apparently, large number of Black leaders throughout the world have thought very differently. And of course, you could say, as a possible argument, that, well, they weren't aware. They weren't aware of what Gandhi was saying. It seems to me difficult to say that in South Africa, where Gandhi's writings were being circulated for decades, right? Or even among the American Civil Rights Movement, and even people who were not really formally associated with the Civil Rights Movement, but were really part of the legacy of Black thinkers who had really worked and grappled with Gandhi's ideas. I mean, the principal example I think of course, is W.E.B. Du Bois. Perhaps the greatest African-American intellectual of the 20th century. And Du Bois, starts a journal called The Crisis, where he writes the first of 20 lengthy pieces on Gandhi in 1921-22. And the last of the great pieces that he wrote, where it becomes very clear that over a course of 40 years, he hasn't really changed his assessment of Gandhi, is a piece he writes in 1959. He died in 1961 in Ghana in exile because he had repudiated the United States, right? And if you read Du Bois' writings, you come away with the awareness that this is a man who fully understands what it is that Gandhi had been able to accomplish, right? And who is fully aware of what Gandhi means in principle to Black people, whether they're in South Africa or in the United States or in the Caribbean or anywhere else, right? Now, it's very interesting in this vein that in 1936, Gandhi is going to be visited by a group of 4 African-American intellectuals. It's led by a man called Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman is a major Black theologian of his day. He writes an autobiography called With Head and Heart, where he describes the several days that he spent with Gandhi at his ashram. This is in 1936. Now, they have a very extraordinary conversation. The conversation runs, as I said, over a period of days. The major portion of this conversation is also published in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, this conversation ends with the following observation by Gandhi. I'll go back to another phase of it in just a moment, but this is what Gandhi says. And I'm quoting here from the autobiography of Howard Thurman. A slight variation of this is in the collected works. It's exactly the same thing pretty much, just 1 or 2 words are slightly different. And this is what Gandhi said in 1936, quote, "It may be through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of non-violence will be delivered to the world," end quote. So what Gandhi is saying to Howard Thurman is that I think that the next great phase in the evolution of the idea of satyagraha and how it's deployed, this next great phase will almost certainly be among the Black people in the United States. Now, in the course of this conversation, Howard Thurman asks him, right, whether the South African Negro took part in Gandhi's struggles, and if not, why? And this is what Gandhi said, quote, "I purposely did not invite them. It would have endangered their cause. It would have endangered their cause. They would not have understood the technique of our struggle, nor could they have seen the purpose or utility of non-violence," end quote. Now, we can spend an entire hour at least discussing some of the complications, some of the ideas that emerge from this. Because if Gandhi believes that non-violence is as old as the hills, if he believes that non-violence, the idea of ahimsa, can be universalized, what does he mean when he says that they could not have understood the technique of our struggle, nor could they have seen the purpose or utility of non-violence? Is there a contradiction? And I want to say none whatsoever. Because we have to understand that in Gandhi's thinking, satyagraha is a process. You don't just begin midstream. It's the same argument that has very often been used against Gandhi. Well, that look, ahimsa worked against the British because the British were, at the end of the day, a gentlemanly lot. British colonialism in India was, compared to Nazism or Stalinism, it was a Sunday picnic. I think, of course, that view is preposterous. It wasn't a Sunday picnic at all. It was brutal. Colonialism is brutal no matter where you encounter it. But the real argument here is that satyagraha is a process. Now, what he's saying is that, look, among the Indians, there is still a level of preparedness. For example, there are elements of the whole thinking about ahimsa which draw upon Jain thinking. The Gujaratis would have been aware of that. There are elements of ahimsa which draw upon the whole Vaishnava background. The Indians would have been aware of that in South Africa. And it is very instructive that some of the criticisms of Gandhi in the United States among Black people, there are some criticisms as well in the United States. In the 1920s, there are Black people who are arguing, Black critics who are saying, some of our compatriots, they're saying, some of our fellow Black leaders and intellectuals think that Gandhi sets us a great example for us, we should follow him. And they say, well, we don't think so, because Gandhi is too much a Hindu thinker. He is working with Indians who are used to the idea of asceticism, the idea of fasting. And he says, we Black people in this country know nothing of this culture at all. Nothing of this culture. It's very interesting that even among the civil rights leaders, none of them really deployed the ultimate weapon in the arsenal of satyagraha, that is fasting. Cesar Chavez did, but he's not part of the civil rights movement, and he comes from a Catholic background. The American civil rights movement leaders were largely Protestant. And within Protestant Christianity, you do not have the kind of history of fasting, particularly its deployment in the public sphere, as you do in the Catholic tradition, which is why you find it in Ireland, right? Now you can see where I'm making a number of arguments here, but what I'm really suggesting here is simply this, that when Gandhi says that I did not invite the Black people, they weren't in a sense really ready for it. It is not by any means a contradiction with his view that satyagraha can be deployed everywhere. But we have to understand that satyagraha really is a process, right? So what I have attempted to do today is to address these questions at considerable length, but I want to now finally, in the last few minutes, and then I want to leave aside some time for questions, I want to come to the matter of what we might describe as prejudice. All right. See, the word prejudice, again, is a word that we have to understand in not just the most common register in which we know it. The most common register in which we know that word in the English language is when we think of prejudice as having a preconceived opinion about something that is not based on reason or actual experience. That's prejudice. Now, the first line of argument there might simply be to say that, well, yes, look, there are different ways in which one can understand what Gandhi was doing. One can take the view that he outgrew the views. One can take the view that I did, which is that it's not simply a matter of outgrowing the views that he had on earlier and arriving at a different set of views, or taking the view that, well, look, that we have to understand what were the constraints of the legal system within which Gandhi was working, and his awareness that he could not take down the entire legal system in South Africa. And therefore, he had to agitate for the rights of Indians, understood as a group of people who were distinct and separate from the Africans, etc. I won't reiterate everything that I've said. I've offered a number of arguments of this kind. But along these lines, one could simply make the concession that, well, Gandhi had prejudices, as we all do. Right? We could take that view. And I think that that would be a softer view than saying that Gandhi was a racist, because I've suggested that we would have to seriously question what we mean by racism. What kind of racist was he? If he was not the kind of racist who thinks that in fact there should be a racial order in which the Indians predominate over the Black people, there is nothing suggesting that he took that view, then we have to ask, well, what kind of racist was he? Was he simply objecting to the fact that he didn't want Indians treated as poorly as Black people were treated? Does that mean that he's happy with how the Black people are being treated? Absolutely not. There's nothing to suggest that whatsoever, right? But I'm saying that leave aside all of that, we can then simply say, as a matter of concession, that the softer view would be that Gandhi had his prejudices, as we all do, right? But I think the matter is still yet more complicated, because let us not forget that the word prejudice means bias, partiality. To be prejudiced means to be partial to someone, a cause, a thing. Now, Gandhi was partial to Indians. He was prejudiced towards Indians for reasons that I have already described. All right. Did he believe in the domination, once again, of Indians over Black people? Nothing whatsoever to suggest that in the record that we have over there. But I think the other understanding that is important over here is that he was prejudiced in the sense that we have an anodyne view in the modern world of what we call equality. Right? In principle, well-intentioned liberal people will strive towards an acknowledgement of the fact that we are all equal. My submission to you, this is the last point I'm really making here, is the following. With the full awareness that this opens up a new Pandora's box, because then we'd have to really look at a whole different set of questions. My submission to you is that Gandhi, quite paradoxically, for a man who was immersed in the life of this world, for a man who is known as a man who engaged in a life of politics, that paradoxically Gandhi completely disavowed, repudiated the entire language of modern politics. That is to say, he disavowed such things as the language of rights, the language of equality, the language of citizenship. In a lecture I delivered, which was the Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture in Ottawa 2 years ago, it's again in October because it's always around the time of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's birthday on October 2nd. I argued very strongly that Gandhi is mistakenly viewed as, quote, a champion of rights. That's not because he opposed rights, but simply because that was not the vocabulary that he actually worked with. He didn't work with that vocabulary. When you look at Gandhi's last fast, it's an extraordinary testament to an extraordinary life. Because you can take a kind of realpolitik view. The last fast was terminated just a few days really before he was assassinated. And one of the reasons he was assassinated is that his assassin, Nathuram Godse, said that, well, it is because of Gandhi, not only did partition of India take place, but the 55 crore rupees that the Indian government had held up when the conflict took place over Kashmir, that it is because of Gandhi that we are now turning this money over to Pakistan, and Pakistan will use this money against us. But Gandhi is not part of these arguments. That's not, because he listens, as he said, to his inner voice. He inhabits a different moral universe at the end of the day. And therefore, when we think about, these questions, we are using a very anodyne, a very commonplace kind of vocabulary of modern liberal thought, which of course is the same apparatus of thought that resulted in colonialism. And Gandhi, I'm saying to you, was ultimately a person who disavowed the language of politics because he understood that ultimately this language of politics is a language of political rationality. And in his view, Satya could not be apprehended through that language. And this is where I would conclude. And some people here might have wanted perhaps a very simple answer to the question, is he or is he not a racist? But I have tried to suggest that there are different ways in which we will have to think about a charge of this kind. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for those words. I think Dr. Papu wants to address the group as well, but I want to remind everyone to send questions in the chat. I see we have one so far. And if you want to prefer to direct message, you can direct message your questions to one of the co-hosts as well. And we will do our best to get through those questions. But before we move into that, I think Dr. Papu just has a couple of words of thanks.
Okay, we have time only for one or two questions. We are nearing almost 7:20. Are there any quick questions,
Did you want to say a few words before we do that?
No, I will say
Ready to go?
at the end, let the question answer go out now.
Okay, she's taking them written in, the questions.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Well, before the questions come in, I want to thank Professor Vinay Lal. You have just tasted a bit of what he talks about. He is the modern gadfly of Socrates tradition, just shakes you up, just go with his YouTube channel or read his blogs and everything, he always shakes you up. That way we're all to use the Kantian language, he wakes us up from our dogmatic slumbers about everything in the world. Just for one compliment or however much you want to take it, his views on any of those things, on American society, politics, and so on, they have earned him a place in David Horowitz's The Professors, the 101 most dangerous academics in America. So he is the 100+1 most dangerous professors, academics in America, and that was a book, long time ago. It was published. thank you for this encouraging. You really shook up everybody in this film. And I hope some of you guys will follow him on the YouTube or read his blogs, Okay. Thank you very much. It was very enlightening and everything which you said. And speaking of the human rights, when Julian Huxley published after the adoption of the Universal Human Rights in 1948, Gandhi was given the first slot to write on the human rights tradition by Julian Huxley. And the volume starts when Gandhi says, there are no human rights. This is the first sentence in the Julian Huxley volume on human rights, Every right that we have, I was told by my illiterate but wise mother that every right that you have must be acquired from duties well performed. That's how it is there. Anyway, thank you very much for coming to Miami University virtually. And
Yeah,
I
they're sending in questions. Alicia
yeah,
will
now
field the questions.
we have got if you have got a couple of questions,
Yeah.
Alicia will ask.
She'll field them.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Alicia.
So Professor Lal, I think you might be able to see the chat as well. It says there's one question about, was non-cooperation part of Gandhi's satyagraha, or is it just about fasting?
Yes. Well, no, non-cooperation is part of what we might call the grammar of satyagraha. Remember that Gandhi led what is called a non-cooperation movement. So this non-cooperation movement was 1920 to early 1922 when Gandhi suspended this movement because of an incident that happened at a place called Chowri Chowra, where Indian policemen were killed by a large crowd of Indians. So the answer to the question was non-cooperation a part of Gandhi's satyagraha. Well, satyagraha is a process, and one begins with such things as meeting your opponent, trying to see what their position is, coming to an awareness, trying to find some common grounds that we have. If one feels that some law, for example, is unjust and the colonial state refuses to remove the law, then what does one do? Then one undertakes to non-cooperate with the oppressor, right? So it is unquestionably a part of satyagraha. And fasting is something that Gandhi was very clear is only the last resort, last resort, because fasting entails a different level of sacrifice, a different level of preparedness, particularly the fast unto death. I should make a little incidental note here. Again, I could elaborate upon this at enormous length, but when we speak about fasting, we should speak of fasting, not hunger striking. The two are not the same from Gandhi's standpoint. I am always astonished at the extent to which these two terms are conflated, even by experienced scholars of Gandhi. Gandhi is emphatically clear. Hunger striking belongs to the realm of duragraha, false form of satyagraha, so to speak, falsehood, because he sees the element of coercion. But not only that, that the call to fast must come from within, right? What the Quakers call the small still voice within you, what Gandhi called the inner voice. This is very much part of the whole ethos of fasting, which must really be distinguished from hunger striking. And here again, to say this is not to enter into necessarily a large moral argument about whether I think all forms of hunger striking should be critiqued. I'm not necessarily suggesting that, but I'm simply suggesting to you what Gandhi's view might have been on this matter. And I think that he's actually really quite clear about this. So when we look at satyagraha, we say that fasting is something that is what Gandhi would say is the most potent form of the arsenal, the most potent weapon within the arsenal of satyagraha. And sometimes one uses these, with always some degree of self-reflexivity. these metaphors, arsenal of satyagraha. It might sound too militant, but satyagraha has a grammar. It has an arsenal as well. There's a language that it has, right? And this arsenal meant that there were all these various things that you could resort to. So non-cooperation, hartal, for example, the boycott, right? Using the old Indian strategy, as they say in English, voting with your feet. So if an entire village is being burdened with tax, oppressive tax, the entire village leaves, which is what happened during the Bardoli Satyagraha. All right. So I think that would be the way of thinking about what do we mean when we speak about something being a part of Satyagraha. What is the arsenal, the grammar of Satyagraha?
Professor Howard, I see you're unmuted. Would you like to ask your question directly?
Yes, sure. It's amazing. This is great. I took so many notes, and because as Dr. Lal mentioned, we had a Fresno State debacle, and then Dr. Lal and others came, and it really helped on this question. But my question to you is this: most of the people who, in my encounter, they have not read much on Gandhi when they ask Gandhi, when they tell us Gandhi is a racist. But you presented as that there are, of course, intellectuals and academics are doing it. What kind of response do you get when you lay out this in front of them systematically? Do they get convinced, or what happens?
Well, it's hard to answer that because, I mean, see, I have been very open about my views, as I am today. I mean, and this lecture will go public. I've given, somewhat similar lectures. I mean, there's always something different. I spoke about this question of racism for another Mahatma Gandhi endowed lecture a year or two ago from Canada, and not the one from Ottawa. This is a different one from Hamilton. And there again, I mean, I'm exceedingly open. So I have nothing to disguise here because my first view of this matter is that whatever criticisms there are, they should be addressed, not avoided. And I think that those who take a different view, I think in the first instance, they appreciate that. See, I take the Gandhian view here, which is that those who are taking a very different view of the matter, I take the view that there is a way to, in fact, actually persuade them. That one has to work at different levels. So that's why, for example, even in this talk, I said, well, all right, let's say he had prejudices. All right. But then let's ask ourselves, are all prejudices equal? For example, white people have prejudices about Black people, but these prejudices have consequences. They lead to forms of discrimination with outcomes that are detrimental to Black people. They could be stripped of their job. They may not be able to get housing. They may be removed from an area. Now, Black people have prejudices about white people. For example, white people can't shoot hoops. They don't really know how to play basketball. That's a prejudice. But what are the implications of that prejudice? None. Relatively, because of the extreme disequilibrium or asymmetry of power between the two. You see, right? So I think we have to always address, I would say, two strategies. Number one, we always have to address every question at many different levels. And number two, we must do what Indian philosophy enjoins us to do, namely do the Purva Paksh. That is that when you make an argument, within your argument, anticipate all the objections to your argument beforehand, if you can. Address them beforehand, you see? And therefore, I think that there is a way actually of communicating even ideas that might be inhospitable to those who are really coming from a view of what I call ideological purity. Ideological purity is the nemesis of our modern life. They are people coming from positions of ideological purity. They think they know everything. Black people who think they know everything about blackness, and white liberals who think they know everything about what equality means, right? And people partaking of positions which are purely positions of identity politics, and which, in my view, are not particularly productive, right? So there are these. It's very difficult, I agree, to dialogue with some people who come from a position of ideological purity, who take this radical view that Gandhi was, someone who, for example, was a pedophile. Why do they take that view? Because he conducted, as Veena, you and I both know, we've both written on that. I first wrote on this over 20 years ago, that Gandhi engaged in a series of what you could call sexual experiments, but we have to understand exactly what was happening there. And of course, someone who simply says that, well, Gandhi slept with an 18-year-old girl, therefore he was a child molester, he was a pedophile. And one says to oneself, the person is just too ridiculous beyond words. But the problem here is that these kinds of views have become very commonplace. They've started percolating because of the nature of social media, the particular manner in which now certain figures are being dragged down precisely from that standpoint of ideological purity, that if you find any defect in anyone, immediately then you blow it up, right? But I do think, that's really the answer to a question, that my view here is engage, and you will always find some common ground, however slight. And then you have to build on that common ground. Right?
Great answer. I agree. Thank you.
Yes. And what a wonderful way to kind of wrap up the talk with that call to engage, which I think is what we've done here this evening. So thank you very much to everyone, Professor Lal especially. I know we have some additional comments in the chat, so I encourage you to continue the conversation, reach out to folks via their contact information. And if you have any questions or need support from our office, you can reach out to us, and we will get you any contact information you need for our speaker or our host today. Okay, thank you everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for being there for the talk. Bye-bye.
Good evening.